The topic that we would be taking today is the translation of the Qur'an into English languages and other languages of the world. In fact, for almost 300 years, Muslim scholars and intellectuals debated the issue whether the translation of the Qur'an in other languages was permissible from the Sharia perspective. And they are still debating that issue. And interestingly, even the tradition of Prophet ﷺ did not convince many Muslim scholars that the translation of the Qur'an is as legitimate as it could be. Imam Tajul Sariya, in his book An-Nihat Hasiyul Hidayah, mentions that during the lifetime of Prophet ﷺ, a group of Iranians visited the mosque, and they had great difficulty in understanding the Qur'an in Arabic language. So Salman Farsi was asked to translate the first chapter, that is Surah Al-Fatiha of the Qur'an, to them. And subsequently, we find that the people from different parts of the world came to the Prophet's mosque. And this is also documented by Imam Taj al-Sariya. Various people and various companions of the Prophet who knew various languages of the world were asked to translate that into that language. In fact, certain verses of the Qur'an were translated into Latin as well at that particular time, during the time of Prophet ﷺ. First complete translation of the Qur'an occurred in Persian language in the 10th century. And from then onward, the Qur'an got translated in all the major languages of the world. In fact, as long as the intellectual cathedral of Christianity was in the Arabian Peninsula, no need was felt to translate the Qur'an into Latin or other languages. But when it shifted to Europe, then Qur'an was translated into Latin language. It was translated in 1143, and it was done at the behest of monastery of Cluny. That translation did not publish until 1543. It was published in Switzerland, and it was published at a place called Basel, which also became eventually the place where the first Zionist Congress took place. Now, this was the translation. The 1543 translation was the translation which became the mother of all translations as far as the European languages were concerned. The English language translations emerged from it, Italian language translations emerged from it, German language translations emerged from it, and almost all the major European languages were inspired by that particular translation. In 1616, German translation took place. In 1647, the French translation occurred. In 1776, the Russian translation occurred. Now, incidentally, at that particular time, at the behest of the Roman Emperor Leonard, a very religious person called Marashi undertook the project of translating the Qur'an into Latin. It was in 1689 that the Qur'an was translated by this man Marashi. Marashi claimed to be a very authentic reader of Arabic language and a scholar. But his understanding of the Qur'an and his understanding of the terminology of the Qur'an primarily came from his Christian sources. In fact, the introduction that he wrote for that Qur'an, he called it Refutation of the Qur'an. That he is translating the Qur'an in order to refute it. And that particular introduction, it was presented to Roman Emperor Leopold I. And this translation also became the second mother translation for other European translations that took place subsequently. In fact, the first English translation that took place was done by A. Ross in 1730, and the second one, which was done by George Sale, which is commonly available in almost all the libraries of the world, was done by George Sale in 1734. And that translation is in fact a translation of the Latin translation of Marashi. So all the mistakes that Marashi has made in his translation of the Qur'an are repeated in this English translation of George Sale as well. And Marashi did not hide his feelings about Islam. He said it very specifically and very clearly in his introduction that his aim was to discredit Islam. His aim was to refute that Islam was a divine religion, that Islam had anything to offer, and he did not hide his qualms about it. So George Sale also took the same kind of perspective when he translated it. Afterwards, in 1861, we find Reverend J.M. Rowell, who arranged the Qur'an chronologically for the first time for the European people. But again, his emphasis was more to show up the Qur'an than to translate the Qur'an in a manner that it deserves to be translated. At times, the personal biases, the personal perceptions about Christianity and other religions emerged in his translations. For instance, he would not call Ibn Maryam son of Mary, rather he would translate it born to Mary. And of course, theologians have argued on those kind of things. And so these are the kind of things that one finds. Now, these translations were in circulation. And when the European colonials came to the Muslim lands, including India, Egypt, and other places, these translations were made available to the Muslim intelligentsia as well. And those Muslims who were well versed with the Arabic language, when they read that kind of translation, they realized the kind of mistakes that were creeping in. George Sale's translation, for instance, is not only inaccurate as far as the translations of various verses of the Quran is concerned, but also adds a number of things. So based on that kind of assumption, a Muslim from a very small town of Patiala in India, undivided India at that time, undertook the responsibility of translating the Quran, and in 1905 the first Muslim translated the Quran into English language. That translation was published from Lahore, which is now in Pakistan, but that translation is not available. It is available only in certain libraries, and it is not in circulation at all. The second one appeared 14 years later. It was done by Mirza Hayrat of Delhi. That translation is also not available. That is available only in library, but that is also not available in public circulation. Then there is another person from Hyderabad, Imaduddin Sayyid Hussain Belgrami. He undertook the responsibility of, again, translating the Quran into English language, and he did 13 parts of the Quran, but he did not live to complete his project, and therefore that translation was not published. That 13 parts are still available with the Osmania University in Hyderabad, and of course they are not published. In 1915, the Qadiani sect also undertook the what you call the project of translating the Quran, and they did certain parts. They translated certain parts of the Quran, but they were not generally accepted by the Muslim public. In 1917, Muhammad Ali translated the Quran, and that became again a very popular Quran at that particular time. But Muhammad Ali did not put any footnotes. He was trying to be literal to the text, and the critique which Abdullah Yusuf Ali has given to Muhammad Ali is that Muhammad Ali has used in his translation almost 40% of the Quranic words, the Arabic words. Rather than translating them into English, he has used those Arabic words, which at times confuses the readers. The other translation that came after Muhammad Ali's translation was in 1930. It was again done by Hafiz Ghulam Sarwar in the Indian subcontinent area, and then it went with the very, it had the summaries, it had the description, it has the history and context of verses. In other words, it was a commentary, and it became popular. But because Hafiz Ghulam Sarwar belonged to another political school at that particular time in India, his tafsir was condemned by the people who belonged to the other spectrum. And at times his tafsir was pulled out from the schools and colleges and from universities and libraries where it was being taught. And again, it is gaining dust in the libraries now. At the same time, when Ghulam Sarwar was translating the Quran into English, Mahmud's Pictal was funded by the Nizam of Hyderabad, or the ruler of Hyderabad, to translate the Quran into English. And Mahmud also lived up to the literal meaning of the Qur'an. He did not go into the footnotes, he did not explain the things, and again he used almost 15% of the Arabic original words in his translation. And that again, according to Abdullah Yusuf Ali, confuses some people. Now, while this was happening, that Hafiz Ghulam Sarwar was translating the Quran and Marmaduke Pikhtal was translating the Quran, a young civil servant of India was also learning the Quran and learning the language of the Quran, and his name was Abdullah Yusuf Ali. He was very loyal to the English crown, yet he had the feeling that if the English people were given the right sort of understanding of Islam and the Quran, probably their hearts could be changed. In fact, he wrote in one of his prefaces that my intention by translating the Quran is to Islamize, or to make English language an Islamic language. He didn't mean that Islamize the language. What simply he meant that the English language could also serve Muslims and Islamic causes. For almost 5 years, he kept on translating the Quran in various verses of the Quran, but he did not have the courage to come out in public and declare that he has done that sort of translation. Because first of all, he was loyal to the British Crown, and Indian ulama at that particular time, the leaders and the scholars were against the British royalty and colonialism, and of course, if he had announced that he was doing that sort of thing, he would have incurred the political wrath of the Muslim scholars at that time. The second one was that he did not also come from a very highly religious institutional background. He came from a family, of course, a very religious family, but his education was all done in England and in secular education institutions. And obviously the question would have been raised that why is this man competent to translate the Quran? But when he realized that these translations done by others were in circulation and was causing confusion, he couldn't hold to himself. And he approached, interestingly, that's what he mentioned, that he approached some young people in Lahore who were 16 and 17 and 19 and 20-year-old boys and girls, incidentally. And he told them that he is translating the Quran for the younger generation, for the future mind, for a young, modern mind, in a language which attain the beauty of English language without compromising the Arabic. And he convinced them that his project was worthwhile. So these 5 or 6 people became his main supporters. And they raised funds and they approached the publishers, and finally in 1935, Abdullah Yusuf Ali managed to produce his translation of the Quran. Abdullah Yusuf Ali in his translation does not give his opinions in the translation at all. Unlike Muhammad Ali or unlike Mirza Ghulam Sarwar or many other translators who have who have given their own opinion to the translation, Abdullah Yusuf Ali does not give his opinions to the translation. Rather, he adds his opinion to the footnotes. And he claims, and to a certain extent that is also right, that he is using the opinions of Zamakhshari, Imam Razi, and Imam Abduh. Although he did not have the opportunity to read the Quran translated by Imam Abduh and Rashid Rida full, because at that time the translation was still going on and being published on Al-Manar, but yet whatever he could lay his hands on, he used those kind of things. So Abdullah Yusuf Ali did not use his own personal opinion in the translation, he uses all those other people. But at times, in his footnotes, Abdullah Yusuf Ali reveals his inclinations. He is more closer to Imam Razi in understanding the Quran than to Zamakhshari. At times, for instance, I mean, he would go more for the spiritual or deeper aspect and deeper meanings of the Quran than a rationalist aspect that Zamakhshari has often taken. But again, his language is superb and his style is excellent, although it is in the Shakespearean kind of language, yet it is still regarded as one of the best translations of the Quran. What basically happened that in 1935, when this was published, he had his copyrights. And in 1984, the copyrights expired. And those people who knew that the copyrights rule immediately jumped on the opportunity. And in Medina, King Fahd printing complex, Quran printing complex, constituted a committee to review Abdullah Yusuf Ali's Qur'an and retranslate or redo it. They formed a 7-man committee, and I happened to speak to some of the members of the committee, and they say that the 7 members came from 3 different religious theological backgrounds. One group believed in the interpretation of the Qur'an as was done by Maududi. The other believed in the interpretation of the Qur'an as was done by the Salafi scholars. And the third wanted to take a more practical approach that we should stick to what Abdullah Yusuf Ali has said. So in that the third wanted to take a more practical approach that we should stick to what Abdullah Yusuf Ali has said. So in that particular committee, the debate became very heated. At times, they compromised, they accepted this position or that particular position. 2 of the members of the committee resigned because they felt that it was a kind of intellectual dishonesty to change the words of Abdullah Yusuf Ali and change his ideas in his footnotes. And according to that committee members, at least in 40 or 50% footnotes were changed, confirming to the theological interests of the group that had taken that kind of responsibility. So Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation is still regarded as the #1 translation as far as the circulation is concerned, and all over the world it is circulated. And one more note before we go to the next translation about the manner in which this brilliant man died. He died in England in 1953. And what happened that 1953, and it is recorded in his biography, that the police commissioner of London noticed a man, an old man, bearded, in a tattered cloth, wearing all kind of, broken shoes and all that thing, walking the streets of London, lost altogether. And at times he would fell down, this man, and somebody would give him some food and all that sort of thing. So this man wrote to the High Commissioner of Pakistan at that time that I recognize this man as the translator of the Qur'an, and he, in my view, is one of the benefactors of the Muslim community, and the Muslim community should take care of him. The letter was responded 6 months later because of bureaucracy. And in this 6 months, Abdullah Yusuf Ali died, and he was buried by some Christian priests and the police commissioner in London, and his grave is still there. And yet nobody knows. Even the Islamic centers in London do not know where that grave is. But it is there in Mosville Hill, which is in northern London, close to the grave of Karl Marx. After Abdullah Yusuf Ali, the other man who ventured in the translation of the Qur'an was Muhammad Asad. His translation started in 1940s, but got completed in 1978. And this is one of the most remarkable translations of the Qur'an for 2 simple reasons. First of all, the author does not take the Qur'an as separate units and separate verses, rather he takes Qur'an as an integral whole. So he takes a holistic approach. He does not treat ayah on its own context and in itself, rather he treats it as part of a whole. And he translates it from that particular perspective, which is totally different from Piqtal, which is totally different from even Abdullah Yusuf Ali, who treats each ayah separately. Secondly, he does not go into the debate of historical context of the verses. He mentions the historical context, but he does not make that historical facts as the basis of his translation of that verse, because he believes, and from the Quranic perspective, he believes that the Quran is eternal, and if it was revealed in a certain context, that does not mean that the context would always be valid. It means the principle or the laws would be valid. So these are the 2 things that he mentions. Unlike all other translators Asad does not use any Arabic word in the translation except 2 words. He did not change the word surah, and he did not change the word Qur'an. All other words are translated into English, and that's why you do not find the mixture of Arabic and English in the English translation, unlike all other translators, including Abdullah Yusuf Ali. Asad's some people have criticized Asad for his position on the issue of jinn, or the invisible beings, or on the issue of angels, or on the issue of Isra and Miraj. But what Asad has written is not out of his own personal opinion. He has quoted either the mother of faithfuls, Aisha radiallahu ta'ala, on the issue of Miraj, or he has quoted other authentic ahadith in defense of the argument that he has taken and the position that he has taken. And by far, in terms of reading and in terms of rendering of translation, Muhammad Asad outstands any other translation as far as the language and linguistic skills are concerned. And then side by side, Yusuf Ali is there. Then 3 more translations that are in circulation, and then I'll finish. One was done by Maulana Majid Daryabadi. It was in 1945, and it was done simultaneously in English and Urdu languages. Although at points his views in terms of translating certain terms of the Qur'an are those of Muhammad Asad. For instance, when he translates ghaib, he does not translate ghaib as unseen, he translated as like Muhammad Asad, which is beyond human conception. But many of the English language scholars regard Majid Daryabadi a very weak translation because he is not either taking the position of Ahlul Rai, the people who use ijtihad, or the people who use traditions. Rather, he is using a mixed position, and at times, according to some of the Mufassirin, his translation does not reflect the full extent of the Arabic terms as well. The second translation was done by Mr. And Mrs. Ziyad. Probably first time you see that a Muslim sister got involved in translating the Qur'an for that. And that was published by Taha Publishers in London, but again that did not gain much popularity because it lacked footnotes, and again it used the Arabic terms as well. The other one is in circulation is by Mahsin Khan, which is based on the tafsir of Tabari, tafsir of Ibn Kathir and tafsir Tabari. And this was done in 1968, but it did not get much popularity. But in 1993, this translation was revamped by the Al-Qura University Medina, and it was adopted by them, and now it is in circulation. And in terms of language, it is weak, yet it relies primarily on the tradition, and it adds footnotes. So this in general is the history of the translations, the Quran in English language. And by far one would realize that the 2 outstanding ones, which are in probably the largest circulations also, are Allama Yusuf Ali and Muhammad Asad. Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aslam, for a very informing lecture. And at least our idea is when we are reading translations, we know something about the context. There are other translations being done now. One of them that's probably pertinent to this center in particular is Dr. Muhammad Fatih Osman is in the last revision of his book, which will be translation of the Quran arranged in topics. This is, inshallah, during 1996 will be out. And there are other trials here and there to continue this endeavor of the translation. A couple of announcements on your way out. You will find the text that we recommended for the course, the book of Ulum al-Quran, and an equivalent book in the Arabic language, and you'll find the Muhammad Asad translation, and you'll find Yusuf Ali translation. And probably we are one of the few places where we have and we still push the original Yusuf Ali. So if you are interested on your way out, you might buy those. You will find application forms if you wanted to subscribe to the Minaret. The videos of the 17 lectures will be available during the middle of Ramadan. So if you want, you put your order form, because you know that it is expensive. It will be sold, the 17 lectures, for $50. O.J. Simpson tape is $30, so you can't go wrong on that. So if you wanted to put your order on your way out, please do that. If you want to order O.J. Simpson, we don't have it available here. And also you will have the audios of the 17 lectures available. Let me go to the next part of the program, and I need your indulgence in that, because we said that after such a serious course, we definitely need your critique, your feedback, your analysis, your input, and more important than that, we need what do you want us to do after that. So this is what we are going to do together now. First slide, please.